January 1956. A teenage couple disappears after what should have been an ordinary date. By sunrise, his body is lying beside a car with the engine still running. She's gone. 2 days later, she's found miles away. The killer leaves behind almost nothing. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no confession. Detectives chase dozens of suspects. One of them would later become one of America's most infamous criminals. Every lead falls apart. The case goes cold. For 65 years, everyone believes the killer got away with it, until investigators discover something that had been sitting unnoticed in an evidence room the entire time. It wasn't a murder weapon. It wasn't a forgotten witness. It was something so small that nobody in 1956 even knew it could solve a murder. And when it finally did, it pointed to a man nobody had ever suspected. This is one of the most unbelievable cold case investigations ever solved. Here is the shape of this mystery. In 1956, a doctor did something small during an autopsy. He took a sample from the victim's body. He sealed it onto a small glass slide. At the time, that slide told him nothing. Science back then could not read it. Nobody even used the word DNA yet. So the slide went into a box. The box went into a storage room. And there it sat. For decades. It sat through the moon landing. It sat through wars and elections. It sat through the rise of computers and the internet. 65 years passed. Detectives tried and failed, again and again. Some retired without ever getting an answer. Families died still waiting for the truth. Then, in 2021, that same slide finally spoke. Not with a memory, not with a confession, with one tiny piece of biology and a family tree built from strangers online. The name it gave police shocked everyone. Nobody had ever suspected this man. He trained horses. He lived close by. At 25, he had married a girl of just 16. By the time his name came out, he was already dead. He had been gone for 14 years. His body had been cremated. This is a story about patience, about one piece of evidence that outlasted everyone connected to it, and about how the truth doesn't really disappear, it just waits. If you're new here, kindly tell us where you're watching from. Also subscribe. It keeps us digging for more cold cases like this. Let's go back to the beginning, back to a girl who lit up every room. Patricia Kalitzke walked through her high school like she owned it. Not with attitude, with ease. She was 16 years old, a junior. The kind of girl other students naturally gathered around. Sock hops, drive-in movies, records playing late into a cold night. That was Patty's world. Then the Air Force brought her a stranger. Lloyd Duane Bogle arrived from Texas. He was stationed at the local Air Force base. He was 18 years old, far from home, in a freezing new town. By December of 1955, he had found Patty. People who knew them said it was instant. He liked her right away. They both loved music. They both loved to dance. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Duane carried a good camera everywhere he went. Not a cheap one. The kind you buy because you want to remember things. Picture him adjusting the focus outside the drive-in. Picture Patty laughing at something just out of frame. That camera would later sit untouched in his car. The film inside was never developed. Nobody would ever see what he wanted to remember. January 2nd, 1956. Just a normal Monday. They went out that night. A date like 100 nights before it. Dinner at the drive-in. Then a quiet road by the river. A spot where teenagers had been parking for years. Private. Quiet. Just outside of town. They were young and in love. They thought the future stretched out forever. They never saw the sun come up. Morning came, and 2 beds were empty. At first, both families believed something hopeful. Maybe the 2 of them had run off together. That happened sometimes back then. So on the morning of January 3rd, that's what they hoped. By noon, that hope had turned into fear. 3 boys were hiking near the river. That's when they found the car. It sat right at the edge of the parking spot. The engine was still idling. The headlights were still weakly burning. The radio was still playing quiet static. The car was in gear, ready to move, but going nowhere. Duane Bogle was lying face down beside the driver's door. Someone had tied his hands with his own belt. Then they shot him in the back of the head. His wallet was still in his pocket. His camera was still sitting on the seat. Nothing had been stolen. This wasn't a robbery. There was no panic here, no struggle. This was calm. This was controlled. This was an execution. And Patty was nowhere to be found. The whole county searched for 2 straight days. Deputies and volunteers walked frozen fields for hours. Then, on January 4th, a road worker noticed something. Down a steep drop off a rural road, 5 miles north of where Duane was found. He climbed down to look closer. Patricia Kalitzke was at the bottom. She had been shot in the head. The autopsy confirmed something even worse. She had also been sexually assaulted. Investigators believe the killer shot Duane first. That removed him as a threat. Then he took Patty somewhere else. The hours between the river and that hillside belonged only to him. Great Falls had never seen anything like this before. A quiet small town had just met a monster, and everyone wanted a name. Police pulled in every lead they had. They questioned soldiers from the local base. They questioned local men with criminal records. They questioned anyone who lived too close to the crime scene. Over the years, the list grew longer. 35 suspects, eventually. Some were cleared quickly. Others stayed under suspicion for decades, without ever being proven guilty. One name on that list still surprises people today. James Bulger, also known as Whitey Bulger. He would later become one of the most infamous crime bosses in American history. But back then, he was just a young man living in Great Falls. He had already been arrested there once, for rape. He was violent. He was local. He fit the profile investigators were building. For years, his name stayed on the suspect list. But Whitey Bulger did not kill these 2 teenagers. Neither did the other soldiers who were questioned. Neither did any of the other 34 names in that file. Here is the part that is hard to accept. The real killer lived less than a mile from Patty's house. He worked with horses just blocks from where she slept. He rode down that same rural road all the time, the very road where her body was later found. In 65 years of investigation, not one detective ever knocked on his door. He wasn't hiding because he was clever. He was hiding because nothing about him looked dangerous. While the suspect list kept growing, one piece of evidence sat quietly in storage. During Patty's autopsy in 1956, a doctor took a small sample. He sealed it onto a tiny glass slide. Back then, that slide was almost useless. No machine could read it yet. It couldn't be matched to anyone. It could only be saved. So they filed it away, in a box, in a storage room. Decades of dust settled on top of it. In 1988, a detective named Phil Madison opened that box. The case was already older than most of his career, but something about it stuck with him. He spent years chasing leads that had already gone cold. He was really just waiting for science to catch up. In 2001, he made a choice that would matter enormously later. He sent that old glass slide to a state crime lab. The results held a small piece of the future. They found one tiny cell, and it did not belong to Duane Bogle. It belonged to an unknown man. Police uploaded this genetic information to a national criminal database. Then they waited. Whoever this man was, he had never been arrested for anything serious. He had no record in that system at all. He was, in every sense, a ghost. Detective Madison eventually retired. He believed this case might never be solved. Then, in 2012, a new officer took over. His name was John Cadner. He was 40 years old, new to Montana, and this was his very first cold case. He didn't start with a weapon. He started with a scanner. For months, he digitized mountains of old paperwork, handwritten notes from officers who had already passed away, old photographs that still smelled faintly of mold. But Cadner understood something important early on. The answer wasn't hiding in that paperwork. It was hiding inside a single slide from 1956. The national database had completely failed this case. That system only works if a criminal's information is already on file. This man had never been arrested for anything serious, so he was invisible to it. Then, in 2018, the whole country watched a different case unfold. Police arrested a man in California called the Golden State Killer. He had committed terrible crimes over 40 years earlier. They finally caught him using a brand new method. Here is the simple idea behind it. Instead of searching for an exact match, they built a family tree. They used the same websites people use to find long-lost relatives. You don't need the suspect's own information in the system. You just need a distant relative's, a cousin, a second cousin, someone who joined that website out of pure curiosity. From there, experts work backward. They build branches of a family tree. Slowly, the branches narrow down to just one person. Sergeant Cadner watched this case in California closely. He realized this same method might solve his case too. In 2019, he sent Montana's old evidence to a lab in Virginia. Scientists there pulled a full genetic profile from what remained, a ghost made entirely out of data, ready to be searched against the same family tree websites. This profile didn't hand police a name right away. It's not that simple. Instead, it gave them one small clue, one single connection point on a massive map of human family history. This kind of search is slow. It's patient. It looks nothing like it does in the movies. Experts began building a family tree in reverse. They started with one unidentified man. They worked backward through generations of relatives. None of these relatives knew they were part of a murder case. The search eventually narrowed down to 3 family branches. 2 of those branches led nowhere near Montana in 1956. Dead ends. But the 3rd branch led somewhere very specific. It led to a man named Kenneth Gould. Sergeant Cadner started digging into this name immediately. He pulled old city records. He pulled property documents. He pulled old photographs of the neighborhood. What he found made the case suddenly very clear. In January of 1956, Kenneth Gould lived just 1 mile from Patty's home. He worked with horses in that exact neighborhood. He rode those horses down the same road regularly, the very road where her body was later found. And just over a month after the murders, Gould sold his land. He left Great Falls completely. He moved through 3 different Montana towns over the following years. Then, in 1967, he left the state for good. He never came back. He never visited again. He simply disappeared into rural Missouri. So who exactly was Kenneth Gould? In 1956, he was 29 years old, a husband, a father to a baby just 2 months old. He trained horses for a living. He kept a quiet, ordinary life. From the outside, he looked completely normal. He had no criminal record. He had no known connection to either victim. That is exactly why his name was never on that suspect list. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor. But there was one detail Cadner couldn't ignore. When Kenneth Gould was 25, he married a girl. She was 16 years old. Patricia Kalitzke was also 16. Cadner never made too much of that detail publicly. He didn't need to. The pattern speaks for itself. Gould moved his family to rural Missouri. He raised his children there. He grew old there. He died of natural causes in 2007. His body was cremated shortly after. For 14 years, his name meant nothing to investigators. He had escaped every search for 65 straight years. When Cadner finally found Gould's children, he told them the truth. One of them said something that says it all. Sometimes, you just don't know everybody's secrets. Since Gould's body no longer existed, there was no way to test him directly. Cadner needed a different kind of connection. That connection turned out to be his own children. Cadner reached out to them personally. 3 of Kenneth Gould's children agreed to give their own DNA. They didn't argue. They didn't defend their father. They just wanted to know the truth, like everyone else. The lab compared their information to that old sample from 1956. The results left absolutely no room for doubt. The evidence on that slide belonged to Kenneth Gould. The ghost hiding inside that piece of glass finally had a name. On June 8, 2021, the local sheriff spoke at a press conference. He said the words families had waited over 60 years to hear. He said this was as good as it would ever get. There would be no trial, no arrest, no moment in a courtroom. The man responsible had already been dead for 14 years, but the file finally had one word stamped on it: closed. For Sergeant Cadner, there was no doubt left in his mind. After 65 years of silence, there was finally an answer. But this kind of gap in time doesn't leave much room for celebration. Duane's brother had already died back in 2013. He carried the weight of this unsolved case his whole life. His wife later said that not knowing had shaped him deeply. Patty's sister was still alive when the news came out, but memory loss had already taken away her ability to understand it. The truth arrived decades too late to bring her any comfort. So this isn't a story with a triumphant ending. It's a story about one piece of evidence that simply refused to disappear. That glass slide still exists today. It sits in an evidence room in Great Falls, Montana. It's smaller than your fingernail. One tiny sample, smaller than a grain of dust. It was collected by a doctor who had never even heard of DNA. It sat quietly through decades of change, through new wars, through new technology, through an entire world moving on without it. It waited. It outlasted every lie Kenneth Gould ever told. It outlasted the memory of almost everyone connected to that night. Here is the simple lesson in all of this. Evidence doesn't expire just because time passes. A piece of truth, kept safe long enough, can outlive anyone trying to bury it. Even the person who committed the crime. Think about Detective Madison back in 1988. He chose to send that old slide to a lab instead of letting it collect more dust. Think about Sergeant Cadner in 2012. He started with nothing but an old scanner and pure determination. Truth doesn't always come quickly, but it rarely disappears completely either. If this story moved you the way it moved investigators for 65 years, hit subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, and so do the people at the center of them. Next time, we're covering a case where the evidence was never in question, but the killer hid behind a completely different name for over 30 years. You will not want to miss it.